Which Side Podcast is a proud member of the Which Side Media Collective.
This week's episode is brought to you by the Utah Animal Rights Coalition. Right now, they're renewing memberships, so you can get yourself a membership and get tons of awesome discounts to local Utah places, including the Which Side Media Collective. You don't have to be a Utah local to use that membership either. So just go to utahanimalrights.com and become a member today. We're going to be having a Veg Fest shortly here as well, so most of the proceeds will go to funding that.
You know, if you do live here in Utah, it's a no-brainer. You'll get your money back from the discounts like in a week.
Totally.
If you're visiting,
you'll still get your discounts back in a week.
Every place that every vegan will tell you is a must-go, you'll be getting a discount too.
Yeah.
So,
and some of those even give you gift cards. So you pay $20, you get $10 gift card to a certain place here, plus a 20% discount on top of that.
Yeah,
it's a no-brainer.
Just fucking do it. You help support the organization, and you get to experience the awesome shit that we have here. We talk about it all the time. It's a great little scene.
utahanimalrights.com.
This is episode 183.
Yeah, this is another lecture series. Yeah, this is a speech that was given by Josh Harper at the Empty Cages LA event. It's called Reinventing Direct Actions, Alternatives to Theatrical Militancy.
If you're not familiar with Josh Harper, I just fucking love this guy. So,
He's one of the Shack 7 activists that was convicted under animal enterprise terrorism charges for campaigning to shut down Huntington Life Sciences. And
he's currently running an organization, you probably heard us talk about it recently, called the Talon Conspiracy. If you ever want to, get the old chronicled animal rights stuff that was published, zines, magazines, newsletters, things like that, that's where he collates them. It's pretty fucking amazing stuff. So sit back and enjoy. Hey Jordan, what news and events do we have going on this week?
If you're listening to this on the day it was released, in Salt Lake City, Anarchist Black Cross Salt Lake is having its monthly prisoner letter writing night at the downtown library. Totally come out and support. Joseph, unfortunately, just went into prison last week, and so we're going to be dedicating most of our letters to Joseph.
Even if you don't live in Salt Lake, get out, write a letter, especially, if it's your... Get out, write a letter. No matter if it's your first time or you've been to prison before, they need that support. Anyone who has been to prison or knows anyone who has been to prison sees how it affects them and how it touches them, and they just need to know that we are behind them and that they will have that throughout their entire time. Because it fucking sucks. There's just very few things in this world that could even be worse. So get out there, write the letter. If you are nervous about writing a letter, don't be. Just write anything. And if you can't afford a stamp, email it to us. We'll fucking mail it for you.
Yeah. If you are looking for address, we'll have Joseph's address in the show notes, and also links to other websites that provide prisoner support.
For the slingshot this week, May 13th, 1985. I mean, I was alive for this, but I don't remember this at all. But I remember talking about this in junior high and high school, and people not believing me about this. Is when the Philadelphia police dropped a bomb on the Black Radical Move House.
I remember that.
I mean...
No, I remember hearing about it.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, you weren't alive. It is some of the most fucked up shit in the world. The shit that they did to Move makes me sick to even think about. Go look them up. We'll throw a link just to the Basic Move organization on the show notes.
Chuck Africa just had a birthday, as well as some other Africas had some birthdays as well. So you should write them a birthday card.
Totes. I sincerely hope you enjoy this lecture.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So to get started with, I have a bad feeling that what I'm about to speak about is going to be misunderstood. Our movement has a really hard time with nuance and subtlety, and if you don't agree with that, then clearly you're not on Facebook. And so because I think there's a high potentiality today for people to repaint my words in very broad strokes, I wanted to actually start my speech today by giving 3 things that the speech is not about, so that later my detractors will only have to watch a minute on YouTube to know that they're all fucking full of shit. Fuck those dudes. First of all, this is not a speech endorsing pacifism. I have long felt, and I still feel, that pacifism is an unethical philosophy that seeks to disempower the people who are already oppressed in favor of preserving the comfort of the ruling class. I think that the idea that we could disregard valuable tools that could lead to the liberation of billions in favor of a tactical dogmatism is absolutely crazy. And so, again, this speech is not about pacifism. This is also not a speech denouncing clandestine direct action. Underground activism is necessary to the advancement of most movements. I would argue most certainly the movement for non-humans. I want to continue to see people who are part of anonymous groupings taking actions that immediately remove animals from places of abuse. I want to see people continue to sabotage the machinery of that abuse. So this is not a speech that is a denunciation of clandestine direct action. Finally, because I'm getting a lot of messages about it, this is not a speech denouncing groups who use street theater or other forms of disruption as a part of their activism. I was not going to name any names, but I've received so many text messages and emails as of this morning. I'm just going to say it. The speech has nothing to do with the organization Direct Action Everywhere. It's not a denunciation of them. So, now that we've gotten through that, what is this speech about? So first and foremost, one of the things that I would like to see amongst the more militant end of the animal rights grassroots is better internal critique. We're great at infighting, but infighting is not the same thing as a rational discussion of the tactical choices that we're making. Our movement is so fucking good at cheerleading, aren't we? You know, we want to keep morale up. During the Shack campaign, I was certainly very guilty of this. We didn't really examine soberly the tactics that we were using. We didn't really talk very often about the in-the-moment, passion that we were feeling and whether or not that was actually saving animals. But, we fought a lot amongst each other. That's not the same as having a good, solid internal critique. And I know I just referenced rationality a lot. I'm going to insert some emotion into here because Josh Harper's emo as fuck. So, getting to the heart of the matter, what I'm hoping to illustrate today is that the rhetoric and the aesthetic of the Animal Liberation Front and most other underground animal liberation groups is counterproductive, it's corny, it serves no purpose, and that should be abandoned. Y'all gonna sit with that for a second? I'm feeling good about that. So here's the thing, going back to what I said earlier, the speech is not a denunciation of clandestine action. I wholeheartedly celebrate anonymous individuals and groups who immediately remove animals from places of abuse, sabotage machinery, etc. The actions are wonderful, but the imagery of angry young men in black masks is not. And the corny, macho verbiage of, in communiques, and even the term communique, that is fucking corny, man. It's silly, it's counterproductive, and I'm going to argue that even the use of the term liberation front in this era doesn't really serve any purpose. It's non-strategic. It's theatrical accoutrement that serves no purpose. So what era would it have been strategic in? I'm going to go back, and those of you who've seen me the last few years here know that I always go into a little historical spiel. So let's do that again. Let's do that. Everyone cool? Okay. I don't give a fuck if you're cool with it or not. Let's be honest. So by the 1950s, by the mid-1950s, the group League Against Cruel Sports, which at that point had already been around for more than 50 years, basically as a drinking club for wealthy anti-sports people, anti-blood sports people, they began to advocate the use of illegal direct action to immediately intervene in the fields between hunter and hunted. It first came out in an editorial in one of their newsletters in 1955. And later that year, a woman by the name of Gwen Barter carried out the first civil disobedience action for non-humans in the Western world. And I want to point out, the reason I'm saying Western world is because the history that has been most available to me as an English-speaking person and in a world where imperialism, colonialism, and so many, some water. Sorry, a world in which colonialism and imperialism affects the histories that are available to us. I don't really know if non-humans had actions taken for them in other cultures. I suspect that they did. I mean, in India, you have groups like the Bishnoi who've been essentially vegan for, 4 centuries now, and who have, in recent years, done things like stone hunters to death for hunting on their lands. I suspect at some point in the last 400 years that they had probably broken local ordinances in order to save animals. But in the Western world, Gwen Barter was the first one to begin carrying out these actions. She started by going out on a deer hunt, a carted deer hunt, where people would ride in the back of trucks and shoot deer from the back of trucks. So she ran out onto the road and she sat on the hood, or the bonnet, as she would have called it, of one of these trucks, and she held a sign and she refused to move. And she shut down the hunt that day. And then it was only a short while later, less than a year, where she went out on a fox hunt. And as dogs and people with shovels were trying to dig a fox out of a burrow, Gwen walked over and just sat in the hole. So they couldn't dig and couldn't get to the fox. And that was the second act of civil disobedience for non-humans in the Western world. So while Gwen Barter is doing the first civil disobediences for non-humans, and is setting quite an example to follow for some young folks who are pretty soon to start an organization called the Hunt Saboteurs Association. Elsewhere in the world, people were fighting wars of national liberation against imperialist powers, primarily the United States, France, Europe. In general had a whole lot of imperialist powers, including Spain, Portugal, and so on. Between the period in 1955, when Gwen Barter began carrying out her acts of civil disobedience, and like the early 1980s, there were wars of national liberation carried out by what were popularly called national liberation fronts in Irian Jaya, South Africa, the Philippines, Nicaragua, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique. I'm sure I could keep going, but all over the world. These struggles most typically were carried out by people who had been, whose resistance had been suppressed for, decades, if not centuries. These were people who were kept from weaponry, for example. These were people who, if their identities were to be discovered, faced death squads. They faced having their families rounded up, tortured to death. They faced political prisoner camps. So in that context, These black masks were very important, right? Because black masks, they meant anonymity. They meant the ability for these guerrillas to carry out their operations against imperialist powers and to not, then have their homes burned, to not be rounded up and essentially slaughtered. These movements tended to have a very militaristic rhetoric, and they tended to use a symbology that was meant to take a classically disempowered group and to give them some sense of empowerment, right? The imagery of crossed rifles is something that I find kind of repugnant. However, I imagine if I were living in Mozambique under an imperialist power and I was being asked to go up against a state's military, against an entire government, a government that had spread across the globe and had taken over country after country and that seemed infallible, having that imagery, that empowerment, I imagine in that context would have been very valuable. So as these national liberation fronts are spreading across the globe, and I see some of you like, what the hell does this have to do with animal rights? I'm not following you, Josh. I'll get there. As these are spreading across the globe, we start to see people who live within imperialist powers, who begin to recognize themselves as colonized people. Here in the United States, those groups included Yellow Peril, the Brown Berets, the Puerto Rican Liberation Organization, and I'd say probably most famously, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Literally dozens of these groups all started to form around the same time in the 1960s, and many of them are still going today. And they began to understand that they too were exploited and kept virtually powerless from the ruling class, by the ruling class, and often this was on the basis of their race. They were inspired by these national liberation movements. Some of them began to consider themselves national liberation movements, trying to create a nation within the United States. And so they began to borrow, again, this very militaristic imagery. And in that context, I'm not quite sure I can judge. I'm not from that era, and I'm a white kid from small town Oregon. So, of course, it's not just people of color who are inspired by these national liberation fronts. Across Europe and North America, there were solidarity movements that spread like wildfire, especially amongst people who said that they were hoping to lend solidarity to the people of Vietnam. These organizations also took on some of the best and worst aspects of the groups that they were emulating. Notably, though, the imagery of people in black masks holding rifles did not translate into popular support the way that it had in the context of national liberation fronts abroad. So, this begins to bring us back to the animal rights movement. There was a member of the Hunt Saboteurs Association who was in the Luton chapter of the HSA, and his name was Ronnie Lee. He had been inspired very much by a group that was operating out of England at the time. In fact, it was probably England's first armed militant struggle. They went by the name of the Angry Brigade, and I would love if everyone would read about the Angry Brigade and study them not only for their few successes, but for their many, many failures. And just real quick, I want to explain a little something that I think illustrates exactly the difference in context between these clandestine national liberation fronts with their militant imagery that I would argue is necessary, and with the black masks, which I would argue was necessary for them, and then what the Angry Brigade was doing. So one of the Angry Brigade's most famous actions was they went to a clothing store that was catered to sort of more like hippie, bohemian elements, but it was kind of upscale. It was very expensive. No one who was actually bohemian could shop there. And they went there and they bombed it. And they argued in their communique, which means statement or letter. Yeah, we could call it that. I think we could just call it that. That would be okay with me. But we'll go with the militaristic bullshit and we'll call it a communique. So in their communique, they explained that Western society had become a spectacle and that by bombing this place, they were bombing the recuperation of rebellion from the capitalists, and people in Nicaragua were just trying not to have hungry rats sewn into their stomachs by American death squads that were, trained by the CIA. One group was pissed off that people were selling hippie clothes at an expensive price, and the other group was trying to stop being slaughtered and enslaved and captured and tortured. I think that that's the type of difference that we need to pay attention to, that one context was not the same as the other, and therefore perhaps the language, the imagery, and so on are not going to translate. So this isn't to say that the early days of the Animal Liberation Front were some sort of horrible mistake. I think that it was interesting that the Angry Brigades inspired Ronnie Lee to such a degree. I love reading about the history of the Angry Brigades and the people who were involved and how they came to the political positions that they were in. I think that it shows that probably Ronnie Lee had a deeper understanding of politics and economics and so on than we might guess about a hunt saboteur in 1972. Ronnie didn't immediately found, however, the Animal Liberation Front. That didn't come until many years later. Originally, he was involved with an organization that went by the name of Band of Mercy. Band of Mercy, we don't know a whole lot about them. When they were formed, we know that it was primarily members of the Luton Sabs who decided to form them. All of the members who founded it had made a pact, and they said that they would not reveal each other's identities until after such a time as those members passed away, or, of course, if they were jailed for Band of Mercy actions, people would already be aware of their membership. In the, more than 40 years now since the founding of the Band of Mercy, one of the things that we have begun to see as old members have died off is that the gender balance in the Band of Mercy, who had a great name, by the way. I prefer that shit so much more. Oh, man, Hunt Retribution Squad, that kind of stuff. But one of the things that we've seen is that their gender balance, I think, tended to lean towards female. And not to be essentialist in any way, but I wonder if that strong female presence in their group in any way tempered their militancy and kept it from becoming such a corny, almost like caricature of itself. So what happens, is that Ronnie and a guy named Cliff Goodman, they're carrying out a lot of actions on their own without other members of the Band of Mercy. They did several really amazing actions. They shut down a pharmaceutical laboratory that was testing on animals called Hoist Pharmaceuticals. There used to be sealing, actually, in England. There was an island where seals existed, and there was only one boat that brought hunters back and forth to the island. And so the Band of Mercy, they went and they lit the boat on fire. Eventually, the Band of Mercy began to actually liberate animals from places of abuse. And that's kind of what finally got Ronnie in trouble, is he had nowhere to home some rats. And he was a suspect in a series of break-ins and arsons. When the police entered his home, they found the rats. The rats had tattoos. Him and Cliff Goodman, Cliff had left a bunch of his possessions at Ronnie's house with his thumbprints and stuff all over them, including on tools. Cliff and Ronnie get arrested. Ronnie snitches. And, not Ronnie, Cliff. Cliff snitches. Yeah, I know. That would be a fucking bummer, man. I wouldn't be okay with that. But Cliff Goodman snitches. He actually ended up then getting out, and for several years kind of ran like a solo underground group, which if you're a snitch, it's better than nothing. But Ronnie gets out, and now separate, actually, from what I understand from many of the founding members of Band of Mercy, he wrote, and these are his exact words, that he felt like the animal liberation movement needed a harder edge. And so a meeting came together of a few dozen people when he was released from prison, and they decided upon the name Animal Liberation Front. Now, the ALF, as we understand it popularly now, is this leaderless movement, right? It's essentially an idea, a banner under which certain actions can be carried out. If they fall under the guidelines of the ALF, then you can claim it as an ALF action. However, things weren't always that way. Now it's popularly said the Animal Liberation Front, they have no address, no office, no membership rolls. That wasn't true at one time. They actually did have an office in England. It was in the British Union to abolish vivisection's offices, and you could just walk in and meet Ronnie. In the early issues of the ALF supporters group newsletter, there were coupons that you could cut out, and this was true in Canada as well, and the old ALF publications from there. You could cut out a coupon and fill it out with your information if you wanted to rehome animals from labs. I don't get it. I don't know. But they operated this way actually for some time. And there are actually two precedents that I'm aware of the ALF carrying out unmasked daylight raids, probably most famously the one that they did against life sciences research, which was known as Operation Valentine. They went in on Valentine's Day and caused thousands of dollars worth of damage to the company that would eventually amalgamate with Huntington Research Center to become Huntington Life Sciences. During that raid, they took out dozens and dozens of dogs, and in fact, some of the most iconic imagery from our movement stems from that raid. The damage that they caused meant that Life Sciences Research Center was unable to make their next payroll and had to fire off several of their employees. It created this economic condition there and morale situation that eventually caused the place to pretty much wither up and be forced to get bought out by Huntington Research Center. It also saved thousands and thousands of lives, however, as Huntington was just about to begin this great big new contract that now with their trashed research center they could not do, and the project was abandoned altogether. This was the era of popular and supportable direct action for non-humans. And the Animal Liberation Front really wasn't the only game in town. I talk endlessly about the Animal Liberation Leagues, and it's because I run the website with all the shit about those guys. I see the stats. Y'all aren't coming to my website. It's not cool. It's not cool. I would go to your website. I'm just saying. You guys are dicks. But the Animal Liberation Leagues, they were another wonderful example of what I would say was popular and supportable direct action. It's not to say that their rhetoric never fell into sort of a militaristic direction, because from time to time it did. It's not to say that they didn't use this macho imagery, because from time to time they did. Those tended to be the exceptions, though, and not the rule with them. One of the things that they wanted to do is they didn't like the idea of individualistic direct action. They liked the idea of collective direct action. They wanted to bring the public into the laboratories rather than have, this small elite commando unit. Sorry, the ALF described themselves that way many times in the 70s and early 80s, and again, it's corny. But yeah, they, starting at a laboratory in Babraham, they invaded the place with 200 people. They went inside, they took out documents, they took photographs. They were one of the organizations alongside the Animal Liberation Investigation Unit that really pioneered undercover footage in the world of anti-vivisectionism. Their first raid was very popular across England and really across the entire UK. It received sympathetic coverage in newspapers, radio, and television support. And so they began to grow. People saw this on TV, and it was people without masks. The focus tended to be on the non-humans who were being liberated rather than the humans who were liberating them. And so people who were attracted to that idea, people who saw the conditions that these animals had come from and then the conditions that they had been liberated into, were inspired. And at the height of the Animal Liberation League's activity, they were carrying out actions with 5,000 participants. Usually many thousands of those participants would be used as a distraction at one laboratory or another to get the police to go there and be like, that's the target. And then they'd, show up with a few thousand people at another place and break in. The largest number of people that they ever brought into a laboratory compound was 2,200 people. Can you imagine what we could do with 2,200 people inside a lab? I can think of some shit. Anyhow, the ALF, of course, wasn't just in England at the time. Underground liberation wasn't just the ALF. In Australia, for example, you had a group called Direct Action for Animal Rights. There was another group there that was called Action for Animals. And the reason that they went with those names wasn't really because they were rejecting the term Liberation Front or anything. It was because Peter Singer's organization was called Animal Liberation, and they didn't want there to be any misunderstanding. But they were beginning to carry out raids. We started to see raids in Holland. They started to spread to Canada, to France. There were actually raids carried out by a socialist students group during the apartheid regime in South Africa. Many of these organizations were using a rhetoric and a style of imagery that I think was far less militaristic and therefore far more sympathetic and popular than what the Animal Liberation Front was doing. And we saw this massive growth, right? During the 1980s, at the height of direct action for non-humans, at the height of lab raids, at the height of arsons and sabotage for non-humans, we also had organizations like Mobilization for Animals who would call for an international day of action against primate vivisection. And they were getting together 40,000 people. 40,000 people in order to do this, including 3,000 people in Madison, Wisconsin. We were having, Los Angeles is a really good example as well. The World Week for Animals in Laboratories used to be called World Day for Laboratory Animals. Here, nearby anyway, in Los Angeles, we started to see direct action that was being carried out, again, with the focus on the animals, with people who were unmasked, with no Circle A's, with no hammers, with no bolt cutters, with none of that. But these actions were incredibly effective. I'm talking about when Last Chance for Animals invaded the, I believe it was the neurology department at UCLA, and on national television kicked in the doors, ran in white coats, and showed people the reality of vivisection, of cats with devices in their heads, of creatures who were in cages, who were never going to leave those cages unless someone stepped in and helped. This was a popular and vibrant militancy. It wasn't a silly prop for the media. It wasn't an aesthetic that appealed to just angry young men. This was something that could be supportable by a broader, more diverse cross-section of the population. But it didn't last. It didn't last very long at all. And in fact, by 1982, we had the emergence of the Hunt Retribution Squad, who I mentioned earlier. What did the Hunt Retribution Squad do? Fucking nothing. They posed for the media like these crazy ultra-militant posturing photographs One of them actually involves a guy holding a pavement saw, this massive rotary pavement saw. It's very metal. And they desecrated the grave of the Duke of Beaufort, who had already died. He wasn't going to stop hunting. But mostly they issued threats. They said that if hunters were going to continue to beat up hunt saboteurs, that they were going to bring violent retribution and even death to the hunters. And keep in mind, they're saying that they're going to do this in defense of other humans, not in defense of non-humans. But that, rather than like killing hunting, and I'm not advocating this, please don't take this as that. But their argument wasn't that hunting is so atrocious that we're going to kill hunters. It's that beating up hunt saboteurs is so atrocious that we're going to return the favor. They never did. It was all just idle threats. And after a few years, even the media grew tired of them, even though they provided the perfect excuse for the media to vilify us. And the imagery of them, holding battle axes and desecrated graves. There's one of them that's very black metal where they're holding a cross upside down from a grave they desecrated. They faded away. And I think that we can argue that the effect that they had on the lives of non-humans was negligible at best and probably negative at worst. They, of course, weren't the only ones. Also in 1982, a group by the name of the Animal Rights Militia sent out several package bombs in England. Nobody was hurt, but at the time, the people who were the most deeply involved in underground direct action, they were saying in their newsletters that we don't believe this is an action being carried out by animal rights groups. We think this is an industry ploy or a government plot. No one really knows whether or not that it was. But the Animal Rights Militia disappeared for several years after that, reemerged about 4 years later, sent out more bombs, planted some bombs under people's cars, and blinded a 6-year-old girl in one eye. That sounds like something that's positive? Does that sound like something that's ever going to bring us to a point of mass militancy? Something that we can proudly stand behind and wear on our T-shirts? Does that sound like something that's ever going to bring us to a place where we have the strength to liberate the billions of lives who are counting upon us? I don't think that it does. It was an embarrassment. But unfortunately, most militant animal rights publications at the time supported it, and including Ronnie Lee, who later wrote an editorial in the pages of Archangel, that while it maybe stopped short of supporting the action, it called upon people not to freak out about it either. Blinding a 6-year-old is something that I think we should all be freaking out about. Of course, the Animal Rights Militia and other groups, such as the Justice Department, didn't end there. They continue to do other very offensive things, like send out packages which they had claimed during the height of the homophobic anti-AIDS hysteria here in the United States were tainted with AIDS-tainted blood, and it was these very sensationalistic communiques at a time when that was entirely inappropriate. They sent out razor blade trapped, basically it was a cassette box where the cassette would slide into the box, and it would just look like that was part of the packaging. You'd pull it out. Inside there would be a rat trap that had soldered to it razor blades. And the idea was that when someone slid it out, the trap would snap back and catch their fingers. No one was injured, but they actually sent a video of them making these devices to media, and that was shown across Canada. And again, I think that the impact on animals, negligible at best, probably pretty fucking negative at worst, and I'm going to probably side on negative there. They continue today, of course. We still have these silly actions. A few years ago, out on the East Coast, there was a animal rights militia action where they liberated turkeys, and all the imagery didn't really center around the turkeys so much as it centered around the young men, who were rescuing them in their black masks and their, cool headgear that we all use to play Xbox now, and talk about you, Jake Conroy. And And but also in one of the photographs, leaning against a tree, is a shotgun in one of their images. Why? They didn't use a shotgun to get the turkeys, right? There's none of that. None of that happened. I've never needed a shotgun to get an animal out of a cage. Personally, it hasn't happened. I can't think of many popular examples in the current era of U.S. Politics where such a thing could be popular, and I don't imagine that we're in some revolutionary moment where any day now we're all going to be storming turkey farms with weapons. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that that's supportable. I don't think it's popular. I don't think it's going to drag a whole lot of people in our directions, but I think a lot of people are going to look at that and be like, it's a turkey and a shotgun. What the hell? I don't know. I don't get it. But this cult of militancy just became more and more and more ludicrous. And I'd say probably the worst of it was the contamination hoaxes, where suddenly you had an organization, the Animal Liberation Front, which had said since its inception that it had a policy against harming any life, that they would not harm non-humans, they would not harm humans, and that they weren't going to harm the natural environment. And then all of a sudden they're claiming to have poisoned Mars bars or Lucozade or Cold Buster bars, or on the East Coast here of the United States, the corpses of chickens who were in supermarkets. The thing is that these actions were invariably just hoaxes. You know, they'd put food coloring into something, or they would just damage the packaging in order to make it look like something might have been contaminated. The actions did cause several $1 million worth of damage at times to the companies that were targeted. However, it also sent a message to the public in very hysterical terms throughout television, radio, and print media that the Animal Liberation Front was ready to target humans. That your average everyday person, your average everyday consumer at home could eat something and be killed for not yet having adopted our politics. I don't, again, see the value to this. And I don't see how any of these actions have ever accomplished anything of note. And we haven't corrected course since. I mentioned Xbox earlier. I'm going to make an analogy right now that's probably going to make me look like a bit of a fool. But so I play a lot of Battlefield 4, and I'm pretty into it, pretty about it. Part of the Baggers Union Local T42. It's my clan. And I like to get in there and mix it up a little bit in Battlefield, run around and shoot some teenagers. You know what I'm saying? And, we're all sitting there with our headsets on going, I notice a sniper on that ridge. Can I get a recon guy in my AO? Yeah. There's a strategy to these games, of course, but oftentimes what you'll see happen, especially with people who are inexperienced in the game or who haven't really considered the strategy, is they'll get killed by somebody in like one spawn area, and then they'll just respawn there by themselves and run right back into the fire, and then they'll respawn again and run into a grenade, and they won't ever stop and think like, okay, I need to spawn up with this other group. We need to see what weaponry is available. We need to be more stealthy. We need to flank them. We need to divide up into different groups. We need to develop some sort of strategy to actually dislodge this other group of people who keep killing me over and over from wherever they're hiding or wherever they're bunkered down. They just keep running into the fire over and over and over again, just dying over and over and over. And I'm always just sitting there throwing my controller going, fuck you, what the fuck are you thinking? Yelling at them on my intercom, you guys are terrible at this. You don't know how to fly the helicopter, get out. Direct quote. And that's what the animal rights movement seems to keep doing. We just keep seeming to run into the fire over and over again. We keep using like the Animal Liberation Front as an anachronism that we keep trying to recreate generation after generation after generation. But its continuity, of course, isn't nearly so important as the lives that they seek to save. And so why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about the lives that we're seeking to save and how they'd be best served by our imagery? You know, aesthetic, rhetoric, as I said earlier, they're accoutrement that can either help us or harm us. We need to think about what black masks say to the public in the era of ISIS. We need to ask, what understanding does the public currently have of a liberation front outside of the era in which they were receiving popular support and which they were appearing all across the globe? We need to build a supportable militancy that assists a more diverse and mass movement. And that movement needs to lead the underground, not the other way around. I don't want to see the underground as a vanguard that's dictating to the rest of the movement what works best for them. I want to see it as something that supports a broader movement, that lends them assistance and that helps to bring their campaigns to fruition quicker. So when I talk about all this stuff, invariably, you know, what comes up is, well, if you don't like the black masks and the circle A's and the crossed hammers and the hammer of vegan justice falls, like, are we fucking Cobra from G.I. Joe? Are we Cobra from G.I. Joe? Because, come on, man. It's childish. It's so juvenile. But I think that we need to actually remove humans from the focus altogether. I think that we need to look back on how male suffragettes, white anti-racists, we need to look at how they were not the primary face of their movements. And we need to ask why they weren't. And it was obviously very appropriate that they should not be. So why is it that humans, the way we navigate these waters is always to say that we need to be the primary focus of a movement that's really about non-humans? I honestly don't care to see one more image of somebody in a black mask holding an animal, but I do want to see that animal. I want to know about what their life was like prior to their liberation. I want to know what it was like to be born into a cage, to never see sunlight, to never have your feet touch the ground, and to expect to die there, to never breathe free air, and then suddenly there's a change. You're rescued, and you're liberated, and you're moved somewhere, and then I want to hear about their life afterwards. And I think that such a movement, rather than just appealing to angry young men, to subcultural elements amongst like the punk and hardcore movement, which I came out of, which I'm still a part of, which I still love, but which is not numerous enough to ever tackle the issue of animal abuse on a global scale. I think that if we were to focus on the non-humans, I think that most people actually have an affinity for non-humans. Certainly they're enculturated into a system of speciesism where they're continuing to exploit them, where they benefit from their exploitation. But at heart, most people, when you confront them, you know, if you go up and you're giving them the vegan speech, and I think we've all probably done that, what do they say? They say, well, I'm an animal lover too. I think that many of them at heart are. They might be hypocrites now, but I think that we could do a lot more to change their minds and their opinions. And I think that a big way that we could do that is to talk about animals instead of talking about humans and human tactical decisions. I want to hear about that freedom, and I'm going to throw in something real quick about being a prisoner. As many of you know, I spent 3 years in federal prison. And so while I am not as intimately familiar as many billions of non-humans are with confinement, one of the things that really drove me crazy when I was behind bars was seeing the way that prisoner support groups would talk about those of us who were doing time, and the way that they would often speak for us, and the way that they would put words into our mouth, and the way that at times they turned human prisoners into almost some sort of commodity to be traded in, while they were doing their fundraising. Free the prisoners, send us $20. I think that if these political prisoners were here today, this is what they'd say. And it's like, motherfucker, you can contact me. I'll tell you what I'm going to say. We do this all the time with non-humans, and it's paternalistic. And so when I talk about terms like fur baby and stuff like that, how the hell are we still saying things like that? It's an embarrassment as well. So when I talk about removing humans from the aesthetic of direct action, I want to make it clear that that's something that we also need to be very careful about. When we speak on behalf of non-human animals, we need to be very careful that we're not doing them a disservice, putting words into their mouth and so on. I think telling the stories of their lives is a very important thing. I think guessing at their desires is something else altogether and can be pretty dangerous. Anyhow, I think I've made it quite clear that the point of this speech, I can go ahead and close this now, is that so much of what we do as a movement is really about theatricality. You can remove the theatricality from the actions, however, and still retain the action. You can remove the black masks and the communiques. You can remove the "this is between us and the vivisecting scum" and appear to be less Cobra-like. Though you don't know about Cobra, you can talk to me afterwards, big G.I. Joe fan. And in that absence of this corny imagery and corny language, I think we can have something altogether much stronger, something that can help us to build a movement that has the size and the strength that we need in order to overturn speciesism. Thank you so much for having me. So I get a lot of anxiety before and after I speak publicly these days, because it was actually public speaking that sent me to prison. I don't actually write my speeches, but I have sort of an outline, and then there's points that I want to hit along the way. And invariably, in my nervousness, I skip over things, answers to questions that might not be obvious. So if anyone has any questions. Hey. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
And I feel like that's a good contrast to the time. But by the mid-late 80s, they were gone.
They were.
And I never really personally grasped what were the conditions in which, I mean, they lost the support.
Right.
At some point, they were just bored of the rest of the country.
There were a number of things that actually led to the end of the animal liberation leagues, and one of those things was that the model just wasn't really tenable anymore. Once the police and MI5 and Scotland Yard caught on to the fact that there was a core group of organizers who ultimately did decide where the distraction protests were going to be, what the actual thing was going to be, those people's lives just became so deeply infiltrated that they almost couldn't organize these types of actions anymore. And so we actually started to see other liberation leagues outside of the Northern League begin to turn more towards ALF-style actions. And in fact, the Eastern Animal Liberation League, that very infamous image of the masked person holding the black and white dog that's been reproduced so much, they began to carry out masked raids that were much smaller in number and more. Yes, it was Park Farm. And so they began to carry out raids that were more clandestinely planned, although then afterwards they would have unmasked public spokespeople who would come forward and say, we organized this, and try to handle the media aspect of it, at least do that unmasked. But there were actually some other things that led to the end of the leagues. One of them was that during one of their raids, a security guard was trying to prevent a group of people from taking beagle dogs outside. And one of the core organizers who'd been with the League since 78, he was one of the founding members. He was one of the more socialist inclined members. He picked up some sort of implement from one of the labs, like a metal bar or something like that. And he hit the guard and broke his arm. And so suddenly these raids would often end in mass arrests, but as the police usually weren't able to prove anything beyond trespassing, most people just walked away with very light charges. Sentencing did start to go up already, but now all of a sudden you have a crime of violence during a break-in, which brings trespassing to burglary. And so all of a sudden you had, I believe, 22 people who were arrested that day, all of whom received sentences of 6 months or more. And so suddenly to the public, who until that point had not been risking very long sentences at all, most people who were arrested actually had their charges dropped. If they were convicted, they just got a fine. And of course, I think most of us would happily pay a few $100s to take animals out of a laboratory. Suddenly they're faced with a much longer sentence. And so it was sort of a combination of things: poor planning, an assault, people losing trust in the organizers because now this guy is responsible for all these other people doing time. That was a big part of what started to pull it apart. But they had also started to sort of fall behind the curve as this cult of militancy that I mentioned earlier was rising. They continued to denounce those types of actions, but the movement itself was becoming, and I don't mean this in the term of a straight edge spin-off that came later and that was also terrible and a horrible embarrassment, but as the movement began to become more hardline, the rhetoric of publications that were coming out that were in favor of the Animal Liberation Front and such at the time were basically denouncing the leagues and saying that they were soft and saying that don't wait for somebody else to plan a mass action. You and 3 of your friends can go out tonight. So it kind of brings us back to that place of running into the fire over and over again. We're always talking about this urgency, the urgency to save these animals now. We need to save them now. We need to save them now. But short-term victories that happen over and over again don't necessarily lead us towards a long-term victory. They don't necessarily lead us to an ultimate victory. And so, unfortunately, though, the other rhetoric sort of is what won out. And I think that it was actually the culture within the movement at the time that most led to the destruction of the leagues. Hey.
You mentioned Band of Mercy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with Bands of Mercy.
Yeah.
With children.
Yes.
Children's leagues, which I find very fascinating. That whole movement involved in
Yeah.
young people. I'm just wondering about your ideas on that.
Yeah, man. So the Bands of Mercy were originally a youth auxiliary of not BUAV. It was the RSPCA, the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, who actually got that royal addition on there. It wasn't something they just came up with. Queen Victoria actually allowed them to use that terminology. But they had a youth auxiliary, the Bands of Mercy, that actually spread into the United States. Here, there were humane education groups dating back to the 1890s that used to issue these cool little pins and medals that said Band of Mercy to young people who'd gone through humane education trainings. But the mythology in England, and I say it's mythology because I've never been able to find any evidence that this actually occurred, but it was that members of the Bands of Mercy in England, who were young people all under the age of 12, I think that was the cutoff point they had between membership in RSPCA and Bands of Mercy. Pardon me. The mythology was that they went and took their parents' hunting weapons and filled their parents' hunting weapons with dirt or otherwise sabotage them so that their parents couldn't hunt. And so when members of the Luton Sabs decided that they were going to expand their direct action beyond just fox hunting and that they were going to make it a more clandestine activity, they decided upon that name to sort of honor that legacy and that mythology. An interesting thing in the movement at the turn of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is that almost every organization at the time had a youth auxiliary, and the movement was very intent upon. And by the way, I know that there are children here. I'm sorry I curse so much. My mother swears like a sailor. It's how I grew up. I feel really. I do feel bad as a. Okay.
You should still feel bad.
Okay. But almost every organization, from the most corporate and mainstream all the way to the most militant, actually had a youth auxiliary. So for the Hunt Saboteurs Association, they were called the Fox Cubs. And kids would come and they'd be taught how to sab. It's like, you're not old enough yet. You have to be 14 to come out and get beat up by hunters. But we will teach you how to sabotage. And they had this very cute newsletter and a little fox-shaped pin that they used to send out. And they had decoder rings and all kinds of cool stuff. And it got kids at a very young age to begin thinking about not just non-humans, but also the protection of non-humans. The ALF supporters group, in I believe the third issue of their newsletter in 1983, actually had SG Kids, and you could be an ALF supporting child, and they would send you a button and a badge and a membership card, and they had their own newsletter, which was far less militaristic and crazy looking than the SG newsletter eventually became, and the BUAV had the Rat Pack, and it was a punk rock rat. It was flexing his muscles, and that was during the era of the BUAV's radicalism. And I think that was a very intelligent thing, not just the idea that we're going to raise another generation that's already thinking about these issues, but the idea that we're going to try and make our movement more multi-generational. It's something that we've largely failed at, and I mean, I'm 40 now. I stuck around for quite a while, but movement turnover is generally so rapid that your average animal rights person, I would argue, is probably between the ages of 17 and 25. And beyond that, we don't really see people continuing on into the movement, and that robs the young portion of our movement. It does. It means that they're constantly put in a position of having to reinvent the wheel, of not knowing what came before them, of repeating the mistakes that have already happened. It also, I think, has a morale blow. When people see everyone that they were involved with, the people that they began being active with, maybe people they've been arrested with, felt trenches camaraderie with, when they see those people fading away, when they see them disappearing, it kind of encourages them to disappear too. They're like, well, I don't really get along with this new generation, and I kind of feel, in this new generation. No, just kidding. New generation is amazing. I really love seeing all the new animal rights activists who are coming up right now. And we're so happy to see you. We really need new blood. But we need old blood, too. So stick around. Speaking of old blood, what's going on?
I'm trying not to take this personally. But your whole thing about images with people with feedback. I think one of the ideas of that was to show that there was human beings passionate about the ability to create, to take these animals out of that position.
Right.
Well, I do agree, depending on how you look, it may have looked pretty militant, but it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm not sure. So right now you're saying that if someone were to do something like that, which I would never encourage to do, that they should take a picture of them. I mean, I know it's been tried. I know that one organization back in '84, when they raided the monkey lab Silver Spring, they wore masks that were clear.
Yeah, the mime masks.
I hate.
Yeah. Yeah.
The ski masks.
Yeah.
Better, but I mean, in the sense, I understood where they were coming from.
I hear you.
They're trying to humanize it a little bit.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is that if it comes down to people raiding a lab in a ski mask or not raiding a lab at all, I'll take the ski mask every time. Yeah. This isn't really so much a speech against the existence of ski masks or whatever. It's more about the way that we utilize that imagery and the way that we center our whole aesthetic around that imagery more than we center it around the non-humans. I thought that those mime masks were really spooky, but but those weren't the only attempts in the history of our movement to sort of soften the image somewhat. The Dutch ALF was actually the second ALF grouping in the world, and they wore horse masks. Actually, on all of their raids, they wore these horse masks, and I don't know. I found it kind of corny, but it did actually have a very good effect on their media at the time, who saw it as being sort of cute more than dangerous. The French commandos that used to, in France, instead of really having like one continuous name that would get used over and over for animal liberation raids, there was these sort of ad hoc names that got used. And so there was Commando Cat Pat was the name of one of them, and Commando Wolf, and which was actually not named after the animal, but a German animal liberationist who was doing time back then. They also began to worry about the imagery of it. And so some of them wore, Cat Pat was still ski masks and stuff, but some of them began wearing great big wigs, giant sunglasses. They began putting on makeup and stuff on their lower faces, and practiced other ways of basically protecting their anonymity without projecting a threatening, and I would argue sort of more macho imagery. And so again, like, man, I've worn a ski mask. I've definitely masked up before, and I should say that when I talk about internal criticism of the Animal Liberation Front, I'm now past the statute of limitation on several actions that I undertook back in the 1990s, and I myself carried out Animal Liberation Front actions. I won't talk about them beyond that, but this is an internal critique. It's a critique based on something that I experienced and something that I myself perpetuated. It's still an organization or an idea, however you view it nowadays, that I'm sympathetic to, but I think that it can do better. Anyone else? Oh, back there in the corner. Mm-hmm.
My problem has always been the people who do that and they're just on the street doing protests and they're trying to make themselves look like they're accommodating for underground when they're really not.
Yeah.
And I've just found that over the years that, at one point it was that we were being heavily bombarded by the cops in LA. There was a point to it, we were trying to connect ourselves, but we kind of grew out of it.
Mm-hmm.
We realized that it was much better to appear to the neighborhoods, the media, and everything else as regular people, so then we stop kind of wearing it.
Right.
That respect. So I just wanted to make that point. So now I think that it's better to show up on the streets. I think it's normal, it's possible,
Mm-hmm.
it's possible to not be that militant.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of cringe when people turn up like that.
Yes.
One of the things I think brought up a good, great point about the animals we were trying to center on our campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the Eagle Freedom Project has been the most successful there and really paved the way with that, making the animals the ambassadors and really telling their story. And talking to people like Bobby, who regularly bring animals out of labs in the sanctuary. One of his points is that the movement really doesn't support the sanctuary. So we kind of love the liberation, we love the street actions, and then we kind of go, oh, okay, your animals are now in the labs, that's all good, and we don't really support them. So I guess my point is just pointing out there are people now doing that, using animals more as ambassadors in their stories. We really need to kind of support those animals coming out. We don't always know. I know there are a bunch of people who are working with the labs, and that's also another thing I think we don't like. People who work with labs, who then end like not supposed to work with them. But if it means bringing animals out, then I don't care. I'll work
Mhm. Excellent. Yeah, there's a history of people focusing more on the animals than on the human side of things. And I think that we can actually look back at this as sort of a model. One of my favorite Animal Liberation Front raids, the one in which I think the animal took most front and center. And of course, that was the raid which brought us Britches. Britches was an animal who we talked about, who we made a documentary about, who we showed the conditions that he endured prior to liberation and also after liberation. And there were other organizations like Farm Animal Freedom Front was one that that's an interesting one. I don't have the time to get into it right now. But they were also another organization that in their actions, they never showed humans. They showed cows, they showed pigs, they showed chickens. They, unfortunately, were not very good at promoting their actions. So we don't know if media or whatever on them would have ever produced greater participation. But I tend to suspect that it might have. I think we're running over right now, actually. Do we have time for one more? Okay, there's no organizer here. All right, I'm going to keep going. One more. Okay, all right. One more question then. All right. Oh, thank you.
What you're encouraged by currently happening in animal liberation and put your support behind.
All right. Okay, that is a really good question. Right now, one of the things that I'm very excited to see here in the United States, and again, the context is different globally. Things that are effective here might not be effective elsewhere, but in the U.S., I've been really excited to see the reemergence of economic pressure campaigning, and especially as represented by the No New Animal Lab campaign. Those of you who are not familiar with the No New Animal Lab campaign, I ask that while you're here, you stop by, you talk with some of the organizers, you meet Susanna here, and you find out about what they're doing, because quite honestly, we live in a society where I think all of us recognize to some degree that capitalism incentivizes animal abuse. And if we can remove basically capital gain from a company, then we create a negative incentive for them to continue. So right now, one of the things that No New Animal Lab is doing, they're trying to prevent the building of an underground laboratory at the University of Washington. But instead of just going after the University of Washington and protesting in front of the regents and things like that, they're actually going after the construction company that's going to be responsible for building this laboratory. And I imagine that as time goes on, there could be other companies that come up as well. I love these economic pressure campaigns because they give all of us a place that we can plug in. No matter what your level of comfort is, there's something there for all of us. You don't have to wait necessarily to be led, but there is a core group of people who are organizing, who are thinking about the long term. But in the short term, like me, myself, as I mentioned earlier, I've done prison time, I have terrible PTSD. Going to demonstrations is very difficult for me. I'm nervous around people in uniform. I don't like seeing police officers. Sometimes because of the way that people enter each other's personal space in prison is so different from the way that people enter it on the outside, I don't actually like to be around large crowds. But this campaign has such diversity that I get to sit home and I get to make phone calls to the regents, and I get to make phone calls to Skanska, the company that's building this lab. I can go out at night, and there's a large demonstration coming up, by the way, I believe in April 15th. Sorry? April 25th, I'm sorry. But coming up on April 25th, I hope to see all of you up there in Seattle. I might not personally be there because it kind of frightens me, but I am going out at night, and I'm taking posters out with me, and I'm flyering in areas close to public transit, so the greatest cross-section of the public ends up seeing these posters and hopefully coming out. There's so many ways to get behind this campaign and help us move towards some sort of mass movement again, to bring us together regionally, to get us talking together face to face, to build actual trenches camaraderie instead of likes and friends on Facebook. So I would encourage everyone in the room to find out more about the No New Animal Lab campaign. It's, I'd say, what's one of the most exciting things to me happening in the country right now. All right. Thank you all so much.
This week you heard.
Beaver Blink by Fine Cut Bodies.
Right now you're listening to
Brain Breeze by Fingerboard Nerds.
iTunes. Every week we talk about it. Every week we're like, hey, it's fucking important. But this week I wanted to say thank you to Truth Be Told XVX. They gave us this awesome review on iTunes. Great laid-back podcast from Jeremy and Jordan. Features a wide variety of topics and guests on vegan and anarchist spectrums. Would love to hear Sean from Vegan Reich on the podcast. It says his last name. I can't say that. I just don't know how to pronounce it correctly.
Be interesting.
I would love to have him on. Yeah.
That'd be way cool.
It's one of the few albums I own multiple copies of. I don't know why. I fucking love Vegan Reich. My very first AOL name was Rage of a Prophet, one of the Vegan Reich songs.
Mine was Jordan WCW. So
Wrestler.
Yeah, wrestling stuff.
Yeah.
So not as cool. If you're not yet our friend on social media, you should become our friend. We post things on there every day and things that we don't talk about on the show. So just go to whichsidepodcast.com, click on the social media tab, be our friend.
Hey, and while you're there, check out our store. Click on the store link, or just head over there directly, whichsidecollective.org. Get some shit.
We got shirts, we got bandanas, we got patches, we got hoodies, we got zines.
Yeah,
it's a full store.
It's a legit store.
Fully stocked.
Yeah, I'm mailing out orders to Monday morning from this week. Everything is handmade by us too. Like,
by fully stocked, I mean we have the shirts and then we customly screen print them.
Yeah, you order it, then we go, oh shit, now I got to go make a shirt, and we go make it because it's fucking fun, and then we mail it out. We're like, always write a little letter to everyone saying thank you. So go get one. Yeah, and fuck shit damn.
Which Side Podcast is hosted and produced by Jordan Halliday and Jeremy Parkin of the Which Side Media Collective, with web design by Jordan Halliday and sound design by Jeremy Parkin. Booking by Mari Halliday. Theme music by Commandantes. Go to whichsidecollective.org to check out the other shows in the collective. As always, fuck shit damn.